This computer and we are live. Welcome everybody. This is Kubernetes SIG API Machinery. Today is the last day of April 2025. If you think about it, there is never going to be another April 30, 2025. Today is the day. Use it wisely. We have a brief agenda today, but we thought that the topic was good enough, to still meet and have some time to discuss. So without further delay, why don't we get this started? Um, Ronald, do you want to, kick it off?
Sure. Yeah. So I think a couple of weeks ago, we went to SIGARCH and we presented a proposal to have a place for folks to work on a community MCP server for Kubernetes. So since that discussion, we have come up with this proposal to form a new work group to host that project, as well as host a wider scope of looking into how agentic AI applications can run at scale on Kubernetes, explore that as well. So what I'm hoping to do in this call, as requested, is maybe walk through MCP, give a short demo for folks to make a pitch for what it is and why it's important. Uh, have folks heard of MCP? Or maybe we just go with the demo and then take it from there.
Sounds
Yeah,
like
let's
a
do the
plan.
demo and we'll talk.
Uh, Let me know if you are able to present. You want to take presenting, right?
Yes, I do.
How do we do that? If I remember, I make you co-host. Hold on. More. Make co-host. Let's try now.
Okay. Wait.
I will stop presenting myself. You should be able to share now.
Yeah. Oh, I'll have to rejoin Zoom. Just give me a second. Sorry.
Yeah.
I should have tried that before.
Play background music. I'm not prepared, sorry. I could try to react quickly, but what if I put some music that somebody doesn't like?
We need to volunteer someone to tell us a joke.
All my jokes are inspired.
Joe immediately went off camera. I love that.
Right. Do you see my screen?
We see your screen, yes.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use a pre-recorded demo from Mark Nuri, who has this Kubernetes MCP server. Okay, I'm gonna play this and then I'll pause at certain points, and if there are questions, we can talk about it. So Mark is using Cloud Desktop to interact with a Kubernetes cluster here. So he has requested to create a pod with an image and expose it on a port. And now he is being prompted by Claude whether it can run this particular tool. So now this is where MCP comes into the picture. So with MCP, Claude here has been configured with settings so that the Kubernetes MCP server is exposed to it, and it knows that it has access to certain tools, and one of the tools is pod run. So when he's interacting with Claude, the LLM knows that I have access to these 10 tools that allow me to interact with a Kubernetes server, and the user is asking me to run a pod, and there is a description associated with each tool. So pod run tells it, oh, you can use this tool to run a pod. So now the LLM is using this information to make a tool call. And then it goes back to Cloud Desktop. Cloud Desktop is talking to the MCP server to go and run this pod. And then it's gonna, so you can see here that each time it runs a tool, it is asking for permission from the user. So it first created the pod, then it's getting the pod from the API, then it's creating a route as well. And now, like he's using another tool. It's also configured to go open a browser and run it. So we'll just go through that and then we'll skip to the next demo. So basically, MCP allows you to give access to tools to the LLM. So when you're interacting with an intelligent model, it can interact with the external world, in this case, a Kubernetes cluster, and create, delete, list resources, and so on. So let's go to another demo. So this one was a simple demo, but the second one is more interesting. So in this demo, Mark is debugging a failing deployment in a configured namespace in a cluster. So you can see that the LLM is requesting to run different tools. It's first trying to get the deployment, then it's going to read some configuration, then it will try to list pods from the deployment. So it found one pod which is in crash loop. Then it will try to analyze the logs by requesting the logs. And then finally, it found out the issues and it knew what it had to fix. And it's going in and then updating the resource to fix it. And this is all brokered through the MCP Kubernetes server. Now let's take a short look at how that is working on the backend. So if you go to the code here, so in this code base, there's an MCP server, which is exposing a lot of tools here. So I went to the tools related to the pods. So there is a pods list in namespace, pods get, and so on. And associated with each tool is a description of what that tool does. And that's how the LLM is able to figure out that when a user is asking me to list pods, I should go and call this tool. And your MCP host, which is Cloud Desktop, in this case, is the broker. It sees the request from the LLM to run the tool. It interacts with the MCP server. It runs. It makes a server call, gets back output from it, and feeds it back to the LLM. Now, the model is the entity which has all the smarts here. Like in case of debugging the deployment, it was able to walk through it step by step and make multiple calls into the MCP server and reach resolution. So that's the basic idea behind MCP. But it'll immediately give you pause, right? Like, how can we be sure that it doesn't go and delete something? Or should the user have access to secrets? Is it gonna leak information into LLM that it should not be leaking and so on? So a lot, while it opens a lot of possibilities, there are a lot of open questions around how it should be secured correctly. Maybe it should be read only by default. Maybe it should only be restricted to namespaces. Secrets should be redacted. There are open questions around how auth works, how a single MCP server can handle auth coming in from different clients, where it should be handled, and so on. So what we are saying is that we create this work group, and one of the first items for this work group is to define the scope and work on this Kubernetes MCP server adjacent to the Kubernetes community. So we can benefit from having input from the SIGs in how to design and make it work securely with following all the Kubernetes best practices. So that's a brief overview of MCP. So once you get MCP as a building block, right, there are, imagine AI agentic applications that are using these individual transactional MCP servers and solving bigger problems. So this is a block in a multi-agent system. uh, Now running those system again has a lot of open questions. Like these individual agents will have access to your bank accounts and so on. So how should they be run on Kubernetes? How should they be restricted? Should should there be a namespace per job that just gets destroyed at the end of a transaction and so on? So that's the second area that we want to explore in this work group. Any questions?
Yeah, maybe Renal will jump in. I know Ben, you asked a question. So this is Derek. He and I were both kind of pitching this concept to kind of get people's perspectives. One thing I just want to make clear is like this repo he demoed from is just an internal experiment. And in fact, one of the risks we see is there's a lot of other Kubernetes MCP servers popping up in the wild. And in some cases, they're being linked to by prominent brands as maybe a trusted entity to go and do this style of integration. And I think one of the things that was motivating our exploration of getting this working group formed was uh, trying to find a place to coalesce the community to work on this problem space together so that we don't have this fragmented set of links. If you do a Google search of like Kubernetes MCP servers, you might find 15 today and 30 tomorrow, which shows that there's like a lot of interested, passionate developers who are experimenting, but we haven't yet found a home for them to coalesce around. And so the spirit of this working group is to try to foster that coalescence. The other thing, particularly with API machinery, and Renal touched on some of the concerns. One of the concerns I have is um, a lot of the NCP servers, and in some cases, you could argue what was demonstrated here is like exploring the what if part of the problem, but not necessarily the what happens after that what if it was a good or bad thing. Like, is it good to run a long running exec flow or not? Is it good to run an interactive command or not? And I think one of the things we're keen in getting API machinery's perspective on, or maybe eyes looking towards, is as a part of like declaring our types in Kubernetes or declaring concepts in CRDs, what can we provide as a primitives to the ecosystem that says like this is an AI redacted field. And so maybe it's like a signal that could feed the rest of the ecosystem. Because one thing we're seeing is a lot of uh, ecosystem projects are also exploring building MCP servers for their context, but they're also just largely interacting with Kubernetes resource APIs. And so if there was any uh, intersection we could provide in the Kubernetes community to like add enhancements to CRD definitions or type schemas that can make it easier to do things like redact if running in a sensitive mode or uh, similar things we could imagine. That's where I thought this SIG would also be really interesting to get their perspective on into this problem space. And with that, hopefully, I don't know, Ben, if that answered your question on reach out, but one of the things we're very open to doing is trying to reach out to anybody who had been exploring the space and just kind of collect interest and try to build a real community.
So it sounds like the answer to that one is no. And there is a discussion in the CNCF level about if this is something that should happen.
Oh, yeah. So Tim's on that one, Ben, had raised on the architecture thread a pointer to the CNCF issue. So that did come up on the mailing list. I guess what this work group proposal is questioning is if creation of the server with affinity to the project is a benefit or not. And
Right.
I think the CNCF issue, we might be exploring a different perspective too.
So, but also you're describing about, using these things as a client and almost saying it almost reads like what was presented here was that we don't think other people know how to use Kubernetes as a client. That seems kind of problematic. Also, setting that aside, this sounds kind of like this is a workload, this is a consumer, the APIs. I get that there's a lot of hype around this right now, and there's a lot of interest in this space. But when I think about things like like web server being one of the early workloads, and we provide the APIs necessarily to build web server, we didn't host web servers itself, though. We have like the whole CNCF space for all these workloads. I'm wondering if it makes more sense for the CNCF to be hosting MCP servers versus like what SIG you think it would kind of fit under.
Yeah.
Um,
So
that
in that spirit, Ben, I guess to maybe answer your questions in piece before I forget some of them. This is really our attempt to try to drive a resolution to that question, right? So I'm not necessarily adversarial to one way or the other. I'm mostly trying to figure out like how do we drive to a resolution because there's a lot of energies that are not being coalesced that could be. In that spirit, I do think there is a benefit in having things um, with affinity to Kubernetes, or at least having a work group open to how we could feed into this ecosystem, particularly around how we declare types that can really maybe help a lot of other participants in the ecosystem by having something done in the space. Like I said, the working group is just proposing the MCP server as like maybe a first place to guide experimentation or thoughts around. Um, but I do think there's something that could be done here. I agree it is a web server, at the end of the day, and which is why we're not interested in like defining like an SDK for building these things. Um, uh, I'm
I
mostly
just
just trying to think through where would we kind of guide a
yeah.
contributor community to, and then a user community to that says, hey, where can I find the Kubernetes MCP server?
The bit about the like types and how we expose information, I think makes a lot of sense. That's the sort of thing that you kind of have to do upstream. The part where we have like a reference MCP server, I think is where I get a little concerned about governance. It feels like we're starting to blur the line. Like if you look at, say, for example, networking, we define the APIs, we don't necessarily host all of the controllers and implementations, and we want a fostering ecosystem of projects that are enabling this sort of thing. And or like similarly, I remember seeing recently some coworkers release this kubectl AI tool, and it's not exactly an MCP server, but it's wiring an LLM to actuate your Kubernetes cluster, and it has a pretty similar user experience. I don't know a lot about that. I don't want to try to frame
Yeah,
my
we were
industry as a
looking at that too. We thought it
competition,
was
but
cool. And
like
in that spirit, we thought
I
that
think
might speak to the motivation on having people to coalesce and just where we could do that is what we're trying to figure out.
right. I think the only thing is just whether or not we we want it to be like in Kubernetes, all of it, versus like, we have a pretty big like the landscape and the CNCF of all the things that run on and against Kubernetes. And that like we've mostly kind of kept that distinction so far. Regardless, if it is something that we do in the project, I think we need to figure out sort of which SIG can host code, versus
Yeah,
like the
so
working group makes sense for figuring out things like how we do the API information.
yeah, totally. So like I think in that spirit, we don't necessarily answer that. And actually the set of code that needs to be hosted is not what we're trying to figure out yet versus as much the use cases and where they intersect. And so I definitely think there's an intersection of like how AI systems will integrate with Kubernetes when they look to interrogate them that we should explore. And that's one of the things I think we tried to highlight in the proposal. A way to feed that exploration is to have some type of place to experiment, I guess, on that. But either way, the actual set of repos created or what gets done or that type of thing, that the spirit of that is to make that an output of the working group, not necessarily like a
Right. But
um,
having like this is our MCP server is very different from having discussions about how MCP servers have done and what changes we need to make to the existing projects to do it.
yeah. And
If we
I
think that we
don't
need
want
to
to dis
have one, then that I think is it's like I would almost like split that
Yeah,
off
and
for
actually,
sure.
I'm not against that, Ben. Like, if the discussion of the work group is like, hey, here's a bunch of things, and here's the perspectives they brought, and why they may or may not coalesce, I feel like that would be a good discussion in the work group.
I think quick suggestion, then I'm going to stop and let Joe go. I think that it might almost be worth even further just like explicitly splitting it and saying, look, we want to have a work group to discuss how we can, like, what we need to do to make these things work. And then kind of independently, we should follow up with, I don't know, CLI or apps or something about if it makes sense to have a reference MCP in them.
Yeah.
People from the work group will be interested, but I
Yeah,
wouldn't want to bog the work group discussion down on that tangent.
yeah, and so that's where I think we listed a number of potential stakeholder SIGs, of which one is this SIG, another was CLI, and I think we're intending to get visits to the appropriate SIGs to get their interest. So yeah, we're definitely not asking for sub-project repo sponsorship or that type of thing just yet. More just trying to think through how we could support um, fostering a community to evaluate this, where there's clearly evidence of a lot of fractured activity happening that could be beneficial. So,
Plus one, this seems like a booming space that needs discussion.
Joe,
Hey, yeah, thanks for bringing this up. I think it's a really interesting topic. I've used some NCP servers myself on a variety of things. So I'm really interested in this space. I think I agree with Ben that the idea of like a repo is something I'm not yet comfortable with. Like, I'm not sure. I agree. I agree the ecosystem should find ways to bring people together and have a space for that. I'm not yet convinced that Kubernetes is like, I'm a little worried that we end up being a kingmaker if we pick a project and maybe there's like somebody else doing a really great job and then the project doesn't have a chance to be successful. So I'm a little worried about that aspect of it, but I'm really interested in helping the community find like a security posture and those kinds of things. I know that working group policy, one of their main outputs was a white paper about policy. And I thought that was a really good way to do it because there's multiple systems out there, some of them that are doing very well in that space. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to help the community set standards, find ways to do things well, right? I think you've mentioned some really interesting things on security posture, like the ability to redact information, things that I'm not sure you can do today easily or in a reasonable way. So that's kind of my take on it. I'm curious if that's kind of the way you guys are thinking about it, or if you kind of have other outputs that you want from the working group.
and Murnau, if you want to answer, I can answer either way. I guess my ask to this audience here would be to maybe focus. Maybe it's an error in the write-up, but we're not in trying to overstep a discussion to jump to a repo versus have a meeting and a forum for us to discuss the use cases and figure out what would be built appropriately to support what that discussion merits, which may or may not include, assumed or unassumed next steps. But it could generate use cases that even among MCP implementers are being difficult to serve because maybe there's something missing in the Kube API definition context, right? So I want to basically emphasize that point as strongly as possible, which is like our hesitation, even when we first reached out to SIG architecture to say, do we think an MCP server is in scope for the Kubernetes project itself? Like we didn't link to a reference implementation of any kind because we didn't want to prejudice a discussion to like a particular entity or not, as more as just like, the Kubernetes project had a CLI. So there was a decision at some point in time, like it should have a CLI. That's a good thing. I think it's an interesting moment in the ecosystem to ask, should it have an MCP server? Or basically, what is its CLI to intelligent systems? It's very rare after 10 years that we have these types of discussions. So this is really where Manal and I were trying to get clarity among the community. And so hopefully that kind of addresses your question. And so if you have, I don't know if it was a mistake, we didn't have common access. It's a struggle here at Red Hat sometimes to share external documents. So if
I
there's an
did
error
open
in
it
that,
up.
we're happy to take updates or recommended tweaks to the
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand what SIG API Machinery is going to be doing to help. If it's towards security posture, and we're going to be working with you on that, and there's going to be an output there from the working group, very interested. I would very interested in that. The repo thing, I'm just not sure yet. I'm willing to talk about it for sure. But I also see risks, right? There are risks that you could build one that works better for some AIs than others, and people are going to be tweaking description fields and things for one AI, and it might be good for one AI and bad for the other. So there is potential for contention there too.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like the prompt that works appropriately for the system, and depending on where these things go, and the user experience, I agree, is attention. Like I said, in this setting, like I think you'll see a list of SIGs enumerated as potential interested parties to the working group. It sounds like there's some agreement that elements of what was discussed here would be attractive here, and also it's clarity on communicated risks or hedging, where you know what next steps there come afterwards would clearly have to be discussed as a part of the working group evolution. But I'm not trying to push a let's get a repo today type of thing in this setting. It's more how do we coalesce a community?
Okay, that sounds great to me.
Joe, your hand's still up. Not there you go.
Sorry.
So I'm in favor of having a working group to talk about the problem space and look at what we need to better participate in it. I don't want to presuppose the solution that that working group will come up with. So I think that's very similar to what Joe said. So I think that is, I would support a working group as far as give us a recommendation, tell us what gaps we have, maybe an output that compares the different options that we have, with the potential to grow and recommend we actually build something. Does that roughly match what you were thinking as well, Joe?
Yeah, I think we're thinking in the same direction. Like, I think this is a really interesting space. I'd like to think more about it. I'd like to be involved. I'd like to talk about it. I'd like to help the community out. I actually do believe that there's a risk of a lot more CVEs happening out there without our help than with. So I think there's an opportunity here.
Yeah, that's actually the motivation, right? Like if we have input from the SIGs here that have dealt with CVEs and all the issues over the years, like we have a better chance of providing the right guidance for making a server the right way.
Yeah, and just the other comment, like I think the other interesting thing that I would think through as an activity of the working group is to kind of just explore, if you look at a system like Kubernetes that supports a structured vocabulary, um, uh, the right way of advertising that to work safely in the MCP system is an area of, like, even when Renal and I sampled a number of different projects that have flourished or been experimenting, people take different approaches to the level of flexibility. Some are trying to open up all of the CLI to the LLM, and others are just trying to do more sparse tool advertisement to the LLM. And I think even just getting a shared point of view from this community on the right way to do that is really informing, because the unintended risks are not always made clear. And so that's why trying to figure out how we can just get uh, like I said, a group of folks interested in trying to figure out how do I do this to maybe moderate surprise, eliminate the extreme risks of CVEs in the world, maybe target particular personas in an operation flow that we think are safe in this style of system. There's a lot of things I could imagine the working group um, experimenting around to try to inform, a recommendation or even a policy paper like you described. And then David, Kube Control AI, when you look at it, also supports running in an MCP server mode. So that's an interesting thing where that project, which I think is what Ben was referencing, it's a plugin that can either take plain text and give it an LLM, and the LLM tells the kube control command to run, or it's a plugin that can run as an MCP server itself, and it advertises all of kube control to the LLM for invocation. But that's one approach, and a lot of other approaches have been taken in that space. So, but yeah, that is also advertising an MCP implementation.
Yeah, I was just asking for transparency. Is a specific goal, like I think an MCP server is the right answer, or is that a decision you'd leave to the working group?
I think this area is moving so fast, and the level of protocols that are either building around MCP or around MCP can change. Um, that I whether or not MCP is the one and only, I don't know. I think it's more like they all have similar patterns, and then how to influence or orient the Kubernetes community to how we integrate with those systems. I think there's some clear commonality among the various competing protocols in the space.
Maciej?
So my question is very much similar to what David just asked, and also you started alluding the answer. Um, because as I'm hearing it, we are focusing a lot on the MCP. In that particular, as you mentioned earlier on, there are 15 MCP product servers that have been created the past week, probably 15 another over the next week. But the part that I'm looking at and I'm seeing the biggest danger and a risk in the future is very likely in 2 or 3 week time, maybe something else will show up that will be, I don't know, called differently. And I don't want to come up with names. And maybe the focus of the work group would be gathering the feedback and trying to come up with a way to standardize a protocol. And we kind of did that in the past over with the CRI interface, with the CNI interfaces. And maybe the primary goal of the work group, whether that will be within the Kubernetes, or probably I'm leaning similar to others that has said previously, maybe in a broader CNCF landscape, and trying to come up with a protocol and look for a standardization that will actually help drive um, the proliferation that we're currently struggling with in this area
Yeah,
towards
Moshe,
a unification of some sort.
yeah, I think the I think it's a mistake to maybe mind map this to like CNI or CRI. Um, and so maybe I can give a little more color to that. So the reason why we're discussing model context protocol is because it's become a very popular protocol and it's being supported by a broader set of like market participants beyond just like the ones you saw here. And so it's driving energy to say, hey, how does your ecosystem integrate with this protocol? There are other protocols I think we linked to in the working group, like A2A came out, and I know Google has announced that. I'm not a Googler, so I don't want to speak for Google, but even in their own positioning, they position MCP and A2A as complementary technologies. So the reason for the discussion here on MCP is not necessarily trying to uh, uh, have Kubernetes invent a different language to integrate with an AI system, more recognizing that an AI system is tending to speak these languages, and then therefore, how do we best present Kubernetes to it? Um, and so that's just like a thing to keep in mind there. So it's 100% not a goal of this working group to try to invent a standard AI, messaging protocol. I think that's far outside the scope of Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a CNCF scope or a Linux Foundation scope, but in this setting, um, we're just trying to figure out how we um, avoid the reality of like registries of these things are forming up, and then people try to figure out trust scores and all sorts of things that are interesting. And um, uh, I feel like figuring out the Kubernetes approach to responding to this shifting dynamic and whether or not uh, the outputs of what this working group can find, I think would be very informing, both to Cube and the CNCF broader.
Yeah, I think a lot of different ways of such integrations have evolved over the year, and MCP is where like everyone seems to have gone behind, and that's why it's gained a lot of traction over the past couple of months. Like what came before MCP informed the decisions MCP took, and now everyone is kind of rallying around it.
Diego, you're next.
Thanks. I think this is a great topic to consider, and I appreciate the roadshow and the external doc. One thing that's always been confusing to me is terminology. Words are always confusing, but the MCP server seems more like a client to me in the applications I've seen so far. So, it's always confusing, like cluster pod, like the same words repeat over and over in our space. I think maybe for this group, an interesting topic to consider in this context is how the API server responds when speaking with agents and LLMs instead of speaking with humans. And the schema aspect and discussion and open API v3 work and declarative validation, some of the work that this group has been doing is useful not only to humans, but also to automation. That's always been true, but it's shifting subtly and in important ways with more AI involvement. I think it would be useful to write down what is implicit in this conversation, that MCP is neutral enough and popular enough. There's some threshold that is intuitive. I agree with it, but I'm not sure, how A to A would stack up or be considered, or something from another vendor would be evaluated. Sometimes it's useful to come up with some metric, even if it's imperfect, so that we can drive the conversation forward.
So I really liked your
So-
perspective on that, and I share it. And I also just I want to appreciate that, like as a red hatter, I don't want to speak for Google, and I'm sensitive to even how to approach A2A in the topic, other than from what I can see externally, A2A and MCP are presenting as complementary technologies. I think I don't know if that means in practice you end up having to create 808 servers versus MCP servers, and the lines that are within there on clients and server terminology. 100% agree with you that it's an interesting dynamic. From what we can see, this challenge of how do you integrate Kubernetes with AI with AI systems is real, and if AI systems are calling Kubernetes, how we respond to those systems. I liked how you framed that. I think it's very powerful. Right now, we see the market pushing us to find ways to respond to those systems via the type of tooling that Mernal demonstrated, which is not the type of tooling that Kubernetes traditionally is advertising today. And that's the tension I think we're unwinding here. And then interesting things around how the type of tooling that we're all demonstrated here can be responded to by the API servers that we serve today is a very interesting thing, right? That's why I was talking about, like, could it redact if it saw different user agents or different modalities that it was being invoked in? That's part of the spirit of what this working group was trying to inspire discussion around. So hopefully, I guess that felt or resonated true with you.
Yeah, I think it's a good direction. I'm also curious about MCP servers in the API server, like as part of a controller and what it might be able to do. So that is another interesting area. So anyway, I'm supportive of exploring. I share the caution of being the kingmaker and finding one implementation, or versus the plugin. So finding the right layers, I think, is the critical task.
Yeah, I think there are definitely possibilities here. You can be running this in a cluster closer to the API server, or you can run it close to your kubectl, and that changes the security and auth concerns drastically. So all of that is definitely in scope to figure out.
I guess, but the question I guess I would have for us and Renal is one, if there are any updates to the working group proposal that we can make, please don't hesitate to share those. And then two, if there are particular problem domains that we discussed here that you feel that the SIG would be supportive of discussing. And it sounds like there was a number of things that were of interest, or at least the use cases appeared. Just figuring out how to then support as we go to the next set of SIGs to get their inputs as well. Hopefully we can get to a good outcome to reach a place for people to explore the space. How that exploration then there happens, yeah, I think um, we appreciate all the hedging comments that were raised, and I guess Mernal and I have been in the Cube community enough to know that those things are concerns and can happen, and so we try to figure out how to um, constrain that appropriately.
The document should be open for
Sorry.
suggestions, folks. You can just.
Thanks. I feel like if that wasn't what you're focused on, I would almost like drop the like we should consolidate MCP space thing and even leading with the demo of MCP and kind of focus more on the we need to figure out how Kubernetes is AI friendly and enables exposing information like redaction. I think that's a really compelling argument that will resonate with a lot of contributors. I think when you lead with the CP server, then we get in this whole tangent of like, wait, is this something we should be doing?
Great feedback. I think the challenge there is we're introducing a lot of new concepts to new audiences, and depending on which audience is first hearing it, like even the challenge of like how is the AI system invoking you or not isn't clear. So yeah, hopefully the full discussion afforded here gave better color to what was being um, uh, trying to approach. But yeah, the MCP item is just like a good way of anchoring that this is an AI who's talking to you and not an AI. But I appreciate what your sentiment is on that.
Okay, and so in terms of next steps, looks like you guys have a roadmap of presentations to different SIGs, and maybe converge again in SIG architecture with the conclusions, or you're going to come back to us.
Yeah, so there is a form that we have in the doc there that we're just trying to figure out even if there's a critical mass of people who'd be interested. It's one thing to get a working group, it's another thing that no one shows up to it, right? So if you are interested in potentially showing up, we're just trying to coalesce how sizable that could or couldn't be. So if you would be interested, feel free to express that interest there as well. But yeah, we eventually would want to take the Appa's Google Doc and then go through the process of like making the formal working group issue or pull request and try to go from there.
This is the form right here.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yep, was the one.
that should link to a Google form. So like I said, we're sensitive to the fact that there's a lot of people exploring this space, and so uh, we're not even we're just trying to figure out how we rally what the size of that community would be, and if even who would want to join if they did join as well. So I can, if you're interested, please take a look.
Sounds good. David, Joe, anything else from our side?
No, but I guess I do plan to be at the meeting tomorrow as well. So if something comes up in between, I will see you there.
Okay.
Thanks, folks.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you for the discussion. I think that probably exhausts our topic for today. I'm glad we had the time, it was a light agenda other than this topic, and it was well spent. So that will conclude our meeting for today. I will upload this to the regular channels later, and we'll keep talking about this one, and we'll see the rest of the group, I guess, in 2 weeks. Thank you so much, and have a great Wednesday. Bye bye.